Rocco Million here with my 8 o'clock broadcast, Thursday night, Real Progressives. Today I'm going to be talking about MMT, a little bit of straight talk, what we have to understand about our operational reality, what MMT actually is, what becomes possible with the knowledge of our operational reality. So what is MMT? This is the most important thing that we could be focused on. We have to combat 50 years of propaganda and lies. So this is the most important message we need to be getting out. So sometimes we could be sounding like broken records, but that's for a reason. And today I'm going to be deliberately repetitive, and I'm going to, and that's for a reason. It's because we need to combat cognitive dissonance. MMT is counterintuitive at first because how we think of our household budget has nothing to do with the budget, with our federal budget, because our government is monetarily sovereign and can make dollars by decree. We can't do that. So what is MMT? It's simply our macroeconomic reality. MMT describes our operational reality without bias in a scientific way. MMT is fact. MMT stands for modern monetary theory. It's theory, though, only like gravity is a theory. And like we can observe our operational reality by simply dropping an object, that the operational reality of gravity is the object falls. It's a scientific fact. Just like that, MMT describes the operational reality of our economy. When government spends dollars into existence, they are the asset of the non-government, and it's the liability of the government. Sectoral balances don't lie, and they always net to zero. The debt of the government is the asset of the non-government. That's a scientific fact. So the reality is we're off the gold standard. We have been completely off the gold standard since 1971. All right, so during the gold standard, when we were on the gold standard, if we wanted to increase the money supply without the gold that backs it, each dollar would be worth less gold. It would be devalued. So in order to avoid that, government would sell bonds and use the revenues, and they would tax and use the revenues to increase federal spending without increasing the overall net money supply and devaluing the dollar. This is how they were able to protect their fixed exchange rate. But that's all operationally obsolete now because we're not on the gold standard. Government doesn't promise to exchange gold for dollars anymore. So the dollar now has no intrinsic value to lose. It can't be devalued unless we lose our ability to tax. Government only promises to accept your dollar back to extinguish your tax obligation. That gives the dollar personal value. It doesn't need intrinsic value. It has personal value. It allows me to pay my tax, keep my stuff, and stay free. That value don't change unless we lose our ability to tax. So we don't have to sell bonds anymore, and we don't need to use tax revenues. All right, because we have no fixed exchange rate to defend. The dollar, $1 is always worth one tax credit, regardless of the revenue, regardless of our exchange rate, regardless of the markets, foreign or domestic. All right, $1 is always equal to one tax credit. That's just the way it is. So this means government isn't revenue constrained. Government doesn't need profit. Article 1, Section 8 mandates government mint and tax to provide for the general welfare of society. So all federal spending is brand new dollars created by fiat, by decree, from thin air. Congress literally wills all money into existence by congressional decree, by fiat. So government is supreme in our society per the Constitution. This is revolutionary because it means government is not constrained by anything but real resources. The money part of the equation doesn't matter. All that matters is we have the real resources available to buy with that money. But government always has the same exact purchasing power. It's infinite, regardless of our revenues, regardless of the markets, foreign or domestic, regardless of the exchange rate. Government always has infinite purchasing power. It can always buy everything or anything for sale in its own dollars, in its own unit of account. That's why it makes dollars by fiat, and by decree from thin air. That's the whole point. Government is mandated by the Constitution to mint and tax to provide for the general welfare, not for the capitalist class at society's expense. That's fascism. When you suppress labor and you empower corporations and capitalists at society's expense, that's a big part of fascism. Mussolini called it corporatism. We call it fascism. But anyway, government is constitutionally mandated to mint and tax to provide for the general welfare. Taxation in dollars are just a social construct, just a means of production. Dollars are just a law to satisfy tax. We can't run out of laws. We can't run out of dollars. What government needs is real resources, like infrastructure, like labor for the military, legal systems, sanitation systems, etc. It needs all these real resources to satisfy its constitutional mandate to the general welfare. So government uses taxation to create unemployment so it could provision the general welfare of society with real resources using using paid employment. It uses taxation to provision society with real resources using paid employment. So taxation and spending is just a social construct, a means of production. It's how government got us to stop living off the land and start working for the general welfare of society. It's how we got roads and education and everything else per the Constitution. Government puts a tax on me and my land, and I'm forced to sell my goods and labor. I'm forced to be unemployed, sell my goods and labor to get these dollars so that I could pay my tax, stay free, and keep my stuff. So, capitalism, government owns the private sector with its ability to impose tax and be the monopoly issuer of the only tax credit. Capitalism only exists in the private sector and only to the extent that our socially owned government allows. The only free market is the black market. Even the dollars in your pocket belong to the government, and they're subject to recall, taxation, at any time per the Constitution. We're only legally allowed to spend those dollars, government's dollars, on the government-regulated economy, buying government-regulated goods and services. You can't even own property in America. We all rent. We all pay tax. So, in that way, we're just like communist China. The state owns everything. The Constitution gives the power to government to sit in authority over society, to maintain the general welfare of society. That's the whole point. So we are guaranteed government for, of, and by the people. That's democratically, socially owned government. That's socialism. And it's baked right into the Constitution before socialism was even a word. Okay? We have socially owned government, and it's for the general welfare or the public purpose, as us MMTers like to say, the public purpose. That's what government's function is. When government like Ellis Winningham is supposed to work for the public purpose and let the individual make what they can. Government's never supposed to work for the private purpose of the individual and make society make do. That's fascism. It's a big part of fascism. So government's job is government needs to satisfy the general welfare, and it needs real resources to do this. So it does it by imposing tax. It creates unemployment to provision society with real resources using paid employment. So if government taxation creates unemployment for the general welfare of society, then it's government's responsibility to also maintain full employment for that same general welfare of society. Because after all, poor, unemployed people all over the place isn't how you get civil society. It's the opposite of civil society. The only way government can satisfy its constitutional mandate to the general welfare is by balancing the economy. The only way you do that is by spending at the bottom, maximizing the velocity of money. And so because when you spend at the bottom, the propensity to spend at the bottom is much higher. If people get money at the bottom and they need to spend it, they have needs immediately, so they spend it. When you spend at the top, the propensity to spend is very low. When you give them money at the top, they've had money all along, so they just put it in their savings account. Which option do you think helps the economy more? Of course, it's spending at the bottom. It's just simple logic. Demand travels up. It doesn't trickle down. When we guarantee the jobs at a bottom income distribution, since they make up the largest segment of society, the more dollars they have, the more they guarantee and demand the jobs of the skilled and educated above them. It's simple logic. Demand travels up. It doesn't trickle down. Trickle down has been, debunked multiple times. This is just simple logic, guys. A federally guaranteed living wage job program would revolutionize society at every freaking level. All right, it gives the leverage back to the people, to the average person. The federal job guarantee would make the minimum wage the federal living wage without even a mandate to the private sector. Either the private sector would have to beat the federal living wage, or they wouldn't be able to attract a labor workforce from the living wage job guarantee program. So this would revolutionize the private sector. They would have to redo their business model to really value labor, or else they can't attract a labor workforce from the job guarantee program. It's revolutionary. The federal job guarantee also helps stop local corruption, things like gerrymandering. It restores democracy. It stops police terror, racial discrimination, sexual discrimination. It does all of this with extreme mobility. If a city like Flint, for instance, allows their police to terrorize the people, racially discriminate against people, if they allow their infrastructure to be neglected to the point where people are being poisoned by water, people could simply get up and go to a community that really does care about their people. And they could do that knowing they have a living wage job guaranteed waiting for them wherever they go. What this would do to the substandard city, they would lose their tax base and their ability to operate, because local and state governments really are revenue constrained. Unlike our federal government that never needs revenue or profit to operate. It's constitutionally mandated to make dollars by decree. So this would force local governments and city governments to work for their people, keeping their citizens happy, or else they lose their tax base and their ability to operate. It's revolutionary. The federal job guarantee would even stop imperialism by ending the military's employer of last resort status. This would decimate the military's ability, their leverage to recruit poor people all over the place. All right. No longer would we be the precarious class. No longer would we have insecure labor that, has to go to the military for a stable career. People would be able to stay home and have living wage jobs, rebuilding their own community. is without people to fight their wars, the military would be forced to abandon its goals of empire. They would have to truly defend our nation's sovereignty and truly defend our rights from all enemies, foreign and domestic, from rogue nations to our domestic capitalist class. That would be the only way the military would be able to make people feel enough people feel patriotic enough to join the military in the first place. I'm telling you, this is revolutionary. The federal job guarantee is the revolutionary progressive keystone program from which all other programs flow. This is a democratic means of production. From there we have labor for single payer health care, for green sustainable energy, for nationalized education, kindergarten through college, you name it. And the federal job guarantee destroys the existing capitalist power structures, which is why the ruling class, they hate it. They hate full employment. They don't want us to understand this operational reality, because it makes them irrelevant. This is why the ruling class, through both parties, using the Democrats and Republicans in the 70s, they teamed up and killed the full employment policies of the New Deal. And ever since, we have been targeting 5% unemployment. We have been intentionally making sure 5% of the working class cannot find a job. That's intentional systemic poverty. All right? That's economic terrorism. That's artificial scarcity. That's austerity that kills just like bullets. This is horrible. It's inhumane. Keeping people unemployed and poor to keep prices down is inhumane. And it's not necessary. Full employment with a federal job guarantee is an inflation anchor. With full employment, we can increase the supply of just about any real resource we need for the general welfare of society. That's a much better way to control prices. Remember, inflation happens when demand outstrips supply. So with a democratic means of production, like the federal job guarantee, we can increase our supply of real resources, of just about any real resource we need. Plus, our trade deficit does that as well. We buy the finite real resources of the world with our infinite dollars. So that also helps us avoid inflation. But yeah, it doesn't make sense. This isn't how you get civil society. Plus, we inflict police terror. We criminalize nature and peaceful behavior. You didn't think drug law was about public safety, did you? Because we have synthetic counterparts of just about every illegal drug on the for-profit healthcare side. Has nothing to do with public safety. It's about corporate profits and control. We allow our police to legally rape, rob, and kill people over evil flowers in the name of corporate profits. All right? That's, shit. If a cop thinks you have weed in you, they're allowed to take you to the hospital and have you pretty much medically raped looking for that weed. People get killed on weed warrants all the time. All a cop has to say is they suspect you of being in a drug deal or a drug involved in drugs, and they can confiscate your house. They could seize your bank accounts using civil asset forfeiture laws without even charging you with a crime. This stuff isn't how you get civil society. If you lock a dog up in the closet every day and kick it every day and feed it gunpowder every day, that dog's going to be crazy. And it isn't the dog's fault. It's the systemic factors that the dog was forced to live under. All right? It's the same with society. When you treat our people like enemy combatants, we can't be surprised when they respond like insurgents. It's common sense. That isn't how you get civil society. That's not consistent with the general welfare. So we need to stop inflicting economic terrorism. We need to stop targeting unemployment. We need to target instead full employment. Our deficit should correspond to whatever full employment is. The main concern in society is the general welfare, not profit for the capitalist class. We need to stop police terror by legalizing and regulating all vice for the general welfare of society, because the black market doesn't care about kids or addiction or the general welfare. That's the government's job. The black market is just a capitalist wet dream. It's profit driven purely. They don't care about the general welfare. It's up to our government to regulate. That's why we empower our government to sit in authority over us. But the people, we the people, have allowed our socially owned government to work for the private purpose of the capitalist class at society's expense. And we do this mainly by targeting unemployment. We give the capitalist class a buffer stock that they use as a tool to wage war on labor. This keeps all labor wages down. All right, all working conditions too. When you go ask your boss for a raise, they can simply say no. They got millions of people out there unemployed who will do your job cheaper. Before it's all said and done, you're leaving with a pay cut. Forget a pay raise. That puts downward pressure on all labor wages and working conditions. And we've been doing this from the 70s, both parties. It's wage suppression. It's class warfare. It's fascism. We're empowering capitalists and corporations, and we're suppressing labor. That isn't how you get civil society. That's how you get the opposite. But because so many don't understand our operational reality, they end up believing all these neoliberal lies and scare tactics designed to keep us divided, designed to keep us insecure, to keep us obedient workers. Why fight back if government is financially broke? What would be the point? When we think our government is broke, when we think the private sector funds government through taxes and bond sales, we accept pointless austerity that kills just like bullets until we get government's revenue up. We end up thinking government needs to tax the rich or cut defense so that it could spend today on society and satisfy its constitutional mandate to the general welfare. But that's bull. Government never needs profit or revenue to satisfy its constitutional mandate to the general welfare. And that's why it's mandated to make dollars at will by fiat, by decree. That's the whole point. So, of course, the ruling class don't want us to understand this. Government always has the same exact purchasing power, infinite, regardless of revenues, regardless of the market. Government can always buy anything for sale in dollars. Taxes don't fund federal spending. It's impossible. There's nothing to tax until government first spends it into existence. It would be like trying to start a game of Monopoly by collecting rents. Okay, it's impossible. Money always needs to be issued first. And it's the same way with government, so the truth is, the fact is, federal spending funds taxpayers who then pay tax or buy bonds or etc. Never vice versa at the federal level. It's impossible. It is a simple logic. But of course, of course the ruling class doesn't want us to understand this operational reality. They don't want us to understand that unemployment, imperialism, poverty is just political choices, not operational necessity. They don't want us to understand the government can create dollars at any time by fiat from thin air to satisfy its constitutional mandate to the general welfare, because that makes them irrelevant. We don't need them. We don't need their money. Capital flight don't even hurt us. Let them leave. The government has labor that could take over the means of production. So it would be a democratic means of production instead of a for-profit means of production. So it would be better for the general welfare anyway. So let capital flight happen. Who cares? We don't need them. They need us. We're the majority, and we need to start to understand this stuff. Regardless of the revenues or exchange rate or the markets, foreign or domestic, government can always create money from thin air by decree to satisfy its constitutional mandate to the general welfare. You know, it makes the 1% irrelevant. So they don't want us to understand that. But so this is where people will usually say, oh, but the Fed is private, or the banksters, but the banksters own us. So, you know, what good is any of this information? You know, and ironically, these are the same people that argue against federal deficit spending, not understanding our operational reality. This is why it's so important. When you oppose federal deficit spending, the only other option is inferior monetary policy of the Fed and private credit to balance the economy. That's horrible, because private credit always dries up, so it leads to booms, busts, and bailouts. And guess what? Government has to move into a big deficit position anyway to bail out the top. Right? But all the money just goes to the top, and it doesn't help society. So the bottom line is we got to make government deficit enough up front, spend enough up front, and distribute it to balance the economy by spending at the bottom, you know, maximizing the velocity of money by spending at the bottom with a federally guaranteed living wage job for every single person who wants one. Then, you know, the monetary policy of the Fed and private credit are irrelevant. People wouldn't be vulnerable to predatory lending to begin with. People wouldn't be dependent on private credit to begin with. So we don't need to focus on the conspiracy theories about the Fed. Congress is the problem, and Congress is the solution. All right? If Congress doesn't pass a spending bill, the Fed is powerless to create dollars. You know, it's that simple. Only Congress, with the power from the Constitution, has the ability to spend dollars into existence. They do that with spending bills, which are really just instructions for the Federal Reserve and for the Treasury to spend appropriations into existence. All right, that's it. Congress can make the Fed do anything. Congress can pass a law and make the Fed do anything. So bottom line again, if the Congress spends enough up front and distributes it to balance the economy, spending at the bottom via a federally guaranteed living wage job for everyone who wants one, the monetary policy of the Fed and private credit become irrelevant. People aren't dependent and vulnerable to private credit to begin with. All right, it's up to we the people to learn this stuff, to learn this operational reality, this simple logic, and to interject it everywhere we see it needs to be. A change will only come from the bottom up when people like you and me, regular people, start to speak out everywhere we go. Get online, talk like I am. I'm no PhD. You know, this stuff is simple logic. Anybody can understand it. It's up to we the people to collectively force our government to satisfy its constitutional mandate to the general welfare of society. You know, government doesn't need revenue. It doesn't need profit. It needs to satisfy its constitutional mandate. Another big pushback we'll get when we start talking about the solutions, you know, it's another huge scare tactic from the ruling class that even, you know, our own people use unwittingly. And it's about hyperinflation. And people will talk about Zimbabwe or post-War I Germany. And the thing they're missing is hyperinflation is always a supply side issue. We could always tax extra demand. All right. Inflation happens when demand outstrips supply. Too many dollars chase too few goods. That's inflation. All right. Hyperinflation happens in extreme cases where something extreme happens to hamper the productive capacity of the nation. So it hurts the supply of real resources of a nation. In Zimbabwe, the freedom fighters, you know, took over and they gave out the farmland that was once theirs. The problem was these people were generations removed from working the land. So they really didn't understand what they were doing. So Zimbabwe went from being one of the top agriculture producing nations in the world to being one of the worst. And to make a long story short, they lost their ability to produce. Their people didn't have enough real resources. So at that point, you know, the government tries to spend more money, but it doesn't work. If you don't have enough bread, more money isn't going to change a thing. So that's when hyperinflation sets in. People will start to outbid each other to get what little real resources are available. And it's the same thing in post-World War I Germany. You know, they had their infrastructure bombed out in the First World War. And they also had to pay reparations to France and the other European nations. So they had to export most of their real resources to pay those reparations. Well, that left not enough real resources for their own people. So no matter what they did at that point, they can spend more into the economy, whatever. It's just going to bid the prices up of the existing real resources. It isn't going to help the problem. See, but America has no problem like this. We have a huge capacity to produce. In fact, we target 5% unemployment. So we're under capacity. You know, if we got unemployment present, we got untapped productive capacity. You know, we can increase our production, you know, with a federal job guarantee. The fact is, deflation is our problem, and it's way worse than inflation. That's why we actually target inflation, you know, because a little bit of inflation is good. You know, deflation, our wages have been stagnant since the 70s. Again, because we've been keeping that buffer stock. We've been targeting unemployment. So our wages have been stagnant since the 70s. While productivity skyrockets, while corporate profits skyrocket, cost of living skyrockets, our wages stay stagnant. That's why this is so important to understand. You know, we're in a race to the bottom. They got us wanting to compete with third world countries so we can get starvation wage factory jobs back. All right. Not understanding we don't need those jobs. All right. Our trade deficit, aka our net importer status, it means we get the finite real resources of the whole world for infinite dollars. And people think that's a bad deal for us. It's not. It could be a great thing as long as government resupplies the dollars lost to that foreign leakage. Because when we're buying products from China, China's getting our dollars. So those dollars are getting out of our economy. So government has to replace that with deficit spending. They have to deficit spend enough to cover the foreign sector surplus and still put our domestic private sector into surplus. So that's the deal. You know, we can increase our supply to control inflation with our trade deficit. You know, this is why we even after trillions in bailouts, trillions in endless wars and corporate welfares, and not only did we not raise tax, we lowered taxes. Yet we still don't have no inflation problem. As a matter of fact, we can't even hit our inflation target rate. So, you know, and plus, like I said, if we got unemployment, we got untapped productive capacity. We can increase our supply of just about any real resource needed for the general welfare with a federally guaranteed job program. Our communities are starved of human resources. They're starved of infrastructure. They're crumbling. And we got unemployment just lying around. Why on earth shouldn't our socially owned government maximize that productive capacity, you know, and raise everybody's standard of living? You know, public debt for society and a higher standard of living is the entire point of government and dollars to begin with. You know, so inflation really is just used as a scare tactic, again, to make us accept pointless austerity that kills just like bullets. Inflation's easy to deal with, not an issue. Another big scare tactic of the capitalist class is the lie about the national debt being a burden somehow. Okay, it's simply not. All right, it's just double entry accounting. The government's deficit is the non-government surplus, our surplus. All right, so every dollar government spends into existence is a liability of the government. Government promises to accept it back to extinguish our tax obligations. That same dollar is an asset to the non-government because it extinguishes our tax obligation. So the government's debt is the non-government's asset. It's that simple, you know. And since we still use the obsolete practice of offsetting deficits with bonds, government debt, you know, and deficit spending is the only way to add net dollars into the economy, our national debt is really a record of all the net dollars in existence. If our national debt was zero, we would have $0 in existence. So, it's not a debt in any type of way. Our national debt in reality is our national savings account. Again, if we had no national debt, we would have no dollars in existence, because our current laws are that we offset deficits with bonds. So, but that is an obsolete practice. We don't have to do that anymore. So for any politician that wants to cry about the national debt and it being a burden, Dr. Joe Firestone developed a simple yet revolutionary clause to be added in every spending bill. And with this language added in every spending bill, it stops the operationally obsolete practice of offsetting deficits with bonds. And it pays off existing debt instruments without raising taxes and without making cuts. So it completely takes off the scare tactic of the national debt right off the table. If a politician wants to cry about the national debt being a burden, so we have to cut social spending or social programs, we tell them simply, hey, you just add in the overt congressional financing clause, and you don't have to worry about national debt anymore. Okay, it's that simple. It destroys their number one scare tactic used to make us accept pointless austerity, used to make us accept intentional poverty, intentional unemployment. Takes it right off the table. So when people think government is broke, they're less likely to fight for the disenfranchised or the neglected, because in their mind, to help somebody else means they may get less. All right. But the truth is, life is not a zero-sum game like that. All right. We have tons of real resources to meet everybody's base needs in America. There is no reason anybody should have to go without the basic necessities of life. We have about 3 million homeless people, about 5 million foreclosed empty houses. Tell me why we have homelessness. All right. We have more than enough real resources to have single-payer health care. We already cover everybody through the ERs. It's just a lot less efficient. It's a lot less humane, So MMT destroys all these lies that keep us from uniting in solidarity using just simple logic. This is why MMT is the revolutionary vehicle we've all been waiting for. This is why I call MMT kryptonite for neoliberalism. Because it really does. It destroys their talking points with simple logic and common sense. Once we understand our operational reality, we understand unemployment, poverty, even imperialism are just political choices. They are not operational necessities. All right? Then we will no longer accept this economic terror. We will force our socially owned government to satisfy its constitutional mandate to the general welfare first and foremost. It's just like the Great Depression. Labor united in solidarity, occupied the factories, wouldn't let anybody work. The ruling class was forced to give us the full employment policies of the New Deal. They didn't want to give that up. Labor made them, because when labor unites, all they got to do is put their hands in their pockets, and the capitalist class is whooped. That's it. So, the ruling class had to meet their demands, and the economy was much more balanced as a result. The majority of federal spending went to the 99% at that time. You can get a job straight out of high school and support a family with one income and have a wife at home with your kids. People were happier, now minus the racism and all that. But in a modern context, we don't need that either. This is how we get by. So we need everybody to understand these things. When labor unites, there's nothing they could do. The working class unites for one day. We stay home from work for one day, and we watch America grind to a halt. We can go back to work the next day. Who can't miss one day of work? All right, we go back to work the next day, but having demonstrated our ability to organize and shut shit down. Now we can leverage that ability to get our demands met. All right. This is how every working class gain has been got from the beginning of history. You know, I see somebody laughing, but obviously they just don't know much because the ruling class never just gives anybody justice. We have to force the issue. We are guaranteed government for, of, and by the people. But if we accept our socially owned government working for the private purpose of capital at society's expense, then they're going to give us fascism every time. You know, so it's up to us to interject this logic everywhere it's needed. Change will only come from the bottom up. You know, look up Dr. Stephanie Kelton. Look up Dr. Bill Mitchell, Dr. Joe Firestone, Ellis Winningham, Warren Mosler, Pavlina Chernova, you know, Dr. Fidel Kaboob. You know, look up Steve Grumbine. Follow Real Progressives. Follow Deficit L's on all of the platforms, social media platforms, on Twitter, YouTube, on Facebook. We're the ones speaking truth. We are the revolution. We are the media. You know, so if we don't do this, nobody will. Learn MMT. Each one, teach one. Teach it. Get passionate about this. This stuff is very catchy. You know, once you start learning it, you know, anybody can learn it. You know, you can overcome any cognitive dissonance by simply diving into the material because it's just common sense. It's just common sense. Since the neoliberal period, since the early 70s, we've been privatizing the public space. We've been starving our economy of federal spending. And when you do that, the only other option is the inferior monetary policy of the Federal Reserve and private credit to balance the economy. And again, that is bad because private credit always dries up. So that leads to booms, busts, and bailouts that only help the rich. And government has to move into a big deficit position anyway to help the rich, you know, to bail out the rich. So instead of all that, we need government to deficit enough up front, to spend enough up front and distribute that spending to balance the economy by maximizing the velocity of money, spending at the bottom of a federally guaranteed living wage job for everyone who wants one. Then the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve and private credit are irrelevant. People wouldn't be vulnerable to predatory lending. People wouldn't be dependent on private credit to begin with. And this is why this is so important, and it's not hard, you know? So let's see what, let's see, is there anybody in the comments that is talking shit? Let's see, any questions, anyone? The guy that's laughing, let's see, what are you laughing about, bro? What don't you understand here? Exactly. What don't you understand? I can help you with it. Everything I said here is fact. It's simple logic. All right? Well, they laugh, but they can't talk. Oh, I can't even see their comment. That's okay. I'll correct you in the comments, I guess. But that's our operational reality. That's why MMT is so important. There is no progressive movement without MMT. If you can't pay for your programs, you're going to accept pointless austerity. If you think you got to tax the rich before you could spend on society, you're going to accept pointless austerity. If you think you have to cut the fence before government can satisfy its constitutional mandate to the general welfare, you're going to accept austerity. That's the whole point. So learn this operational reality and teach it to everyone you know. It's the only way change will come. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you tune in to Dr. Joe Firestone directly after this program at 9 o'clock on Real Progressives. Thanks a lot, guys. Take it easy.